Greetings and welcome back to Room 303 in Senior A English. We are in Unit number 2. I'm with you on pages 178, 179 and following. We're now going to look at the great Barbara W. Tuchman's cutting from A Distant Mirror. I just want to read a little bit of information about her on page 178 because it's significant that we are pointing out the information as we get ready for the reading. Note the dates, 1912 to 1989, two-time Pulitzer Prize winner, pursued a career in journalism before turning to history. She believed that books about history should engage readers with an interesting narrative rather than overwhelm them with facts. Her book, The Guns of August, published in 1962, was an analysis of events leading up to World War I. Like A Distant Mirror, the book was a bestseller that appealed to the average serious reader. Her works include Notes from China, 1972, The March of Folly, From Troy to Vietnam, 1972, and The First Salute, 1988. Let's look at background information real quickly on 179. Under the English feudal system, farmers and craftspeople were peasants. They lived on a manor of a lord who was entitled to a portion of whatever they produced. There was no social mobility. A peasant could not move to another manor or rise in station. For many, the burden of taxes and the lack of freedom were a source of discontent. Even so, the king, who was the head of this repressive system, was regarded with reverence. During the poll tax revolt of 1381, this contradiction became the rebels' undoing. Let's go ahead now and we'll read and then we'll come back to do some annotative work. Barbara Tuchman's The Worms of the Earth Against the Lions.
From The Worms of the Earth Against the Lions, from A Distant Mirror, by Barbara W. Tuchman. While France smoldered, true revolt erupted in June 1381 in England, not of the urban class, but of the peasants. In a country whose economy was largely rural, they were the working class that mattered. The third poll tax in 4 years, to include everyone over the age of 15, was the precipitant, voted in November 1380 by a subservient parliament to finance Lancaster's ambitions in Spain. The collection brought in only 2/3 of the expected sum, not least because tax commissioners were easily bribed to overlook families or falsify their numbers. A second round of collecting became necessary, which could have been foreseen as an invitation to trouble if the lords and prelates and royal uncles of Richard's government had paid attention to the constant complaints of rural insubordination. They did not, and brought upon themselves the most fearful challenge of the century. At the end of May, villages in Essex, on the east coast just above London, refused payment. The resistance spread with some evidence of planning and burst into violence in Kent, the adjoining county south of the Thames. Peasants mingled with yeomen from the French wars, armed themselves with rusty swords, scythes, axes, and longbows blackened by age, and triumphantly stormed a castle where a runaway villain had been imprisoned. Electing Wat Tyler, an eloquent demagogue and veteran of the wars, as their commander-in-chief, they seized Canterbury, forced the mayor to swear fealty to King Richard and the Commons, and liberated from the Archbishop's prison the ideologue of the movement, John Ball. He was a vagrant priest, scholar, and zealot who had been wandering the country for 20 years, frequently hauled in by the authorities for prophesying against church and state and preaching radical doctrines of equality. Although the poll tax was the igniting spark, the fundamental grievance was the bonds of villanage and the lack of legal and political rights. Villains could not plead in court against their lord. No one spoke for them in Parliament. They were bound by duties of servitude, which they had no way to break except by forcibly obtaining a change of the rules. That was the object of the insurrection and of the march on the capital that began from Canterbury. As the Kentishmen swept forward to London, covering the 70 miles in 2 days, the Essex rebels marched southward to meet them. Abbeys and monasteries on the way were a special object of animosity because they were the last to allow commutation of servile labor. In the towns, artisans and small tradesmen, sharing the quarrel of the little against the great, gave aid and food to the peasants. As the sound of the rising spread to other counties, riots and outbreaks widened. The mad multitude on its march from Kent and Essex opened prisons, sacked manors, and burned records. Some personally hated landlords, and officials were murdered and their heads carried around on poles. Others, in fear of death, fled to hide in the same woods where villain outlaws frequently hid from them. Certain lords were forced by the rebels to accompany them, whether they would or not, either to supply needed elements of command or the appearance of participation by the gentry. At the same time, peasant spokesmen swore to kill all lawyers and servants of the king they could find. Short of the king, their imagined champion, all officialdom was their foe. Sheriffs, foresters, tax collectors, judges, abbots, lords, bishops, and dukes, but most especially men of the law, because the law was the villain's prison. Not accidentally, the Chief Justice of England, Sir John Cavendish, was among their first victims, along with many clerks and jurors. Every attorney's house on the line of march reportedly was destroyed. If the Jacquerie 23 years earlier had been an explosion without a program, the Peasants' Revolt arose out of a developing idea of freedom. Though theoretically free, villains wanted abolition of the old bonds, the right to commute services to rent, a riddance of all the restrictions heaped up by the statute of laborers over the past 30 years in the effort to clamp labor in place. They had listened to Lollard priests and to secular preachers moved by the evils of the time, and to John Ball's theories of leveling. Matters cannot go well in England, was his theme, until all things shall be held in common, when there shall be neither vassals nor lords, when the lords shall be no more masters than ourselves. Are we not all descended from the same parents, Adam and Eve? Wycliffe's spirit, which had dared deny the most pervasive authority at the time, was abroad. What had happened in the last 30 years, as a result of plague, war, oppression, and incompetence, was a weakened acceptance of the system, a mistrust of government and governors, lay and ecclesiastical, an awakening sense that authority could be challenged, that change was in fact possible. Moral authority can be no stronger than its acknowledgement. When officials were venal, as even the poor could see they were in the bribing of tax commissioners, and warriors a curse and the church oppressive, the push for change gained strength. It was encouraged by the preacher's castigation of the powerful. The tournaments of the rich, they said, are the torments of the poor. They regularly denounced evil princes, false executors who increase the sorrows of widows, wicked ecclesiastics who show the worst example to the people, and, above all, nobles who empty the purses of the poor by their extravagance, and disdain them for lowness of blood or foulness of body, for deformed shape of body or limb, for dullness of wit and uncunning of craft, and deign not to speak to them, and who are themselves stuffed with pride, of ancestry, fortune, gentility, possessions, power, comeliness, strength, children, treasure, proud in looking, proud in speaking, proud in going, standing, and sitting. All would be drawn by fiends to hell on the day of judgment. On that day of wrath, said the Dominican John Bromyard, in terms that spoke directly to the peasant, the rich would have hung around their necks the oxen and sheep and beasts of the field that they had seized without paying for. The righteous poor, promised a Franciscan friar, will stand up against the cruel rich at the day of judgment and will accuse them of their works and severity on earth. Ha ha, will say the others, horribly frightened. These are the folk formerly in contempt. See how they are honored. They are among the sons of God. What are riches and pomp to us now who are abased? If the meek were indeed the sons of God, even if they too were scolded by the preachers for greed, cheating, and irreverence, why should they wait for their rights until the day of judgment? If all men had a common origin in Adam and Eve, how should some be held in hereditary servitude? If all were equalized by death, as the medieval idea constantly empathized. Was it not possible that inequalities on earth were contrary to the will of God? At its climax on the outskirts of London, the Peasants' Revolt came to the edge of overpowering the government. No measures have been taken against the oncoming horde, partly from contempt for all Wills and Cobbs and Jacks and black-nailed louts, partly from mediocre leadership and lack of ready resources. Lancaster was away on the Scottish border, Buckingham was in Wales, and the only organized armed forces were already embarking at Plymouth for Spain under the command of the third brother, Edmund of Cambridge. Except for 500 or 600 men-at-arms in the king's retinue, the crown controlled no police or militia. London's citizens were unreliable because many were in sympathy and some in active connivance with the rebels. 20,000 peasants were camped outside the walls, demanding parley with the king. While they promised him safety, they shouted for the heads of Archbishop Sudbury and Sir Robert Hales, the Chancellor and Treasurer, whom they held responsible for the poll tax, and for the head, too, of the arch-traitor, John of Gaunt, symbol of misgovernment and a failing war. John Ball harangued them with a fierce call to cast off the yoke they had borne for so long, to exterminate all great lords, judges, and lawyers, and gain for all men equal freedom, rank, and power. In agitated council, the government could find no course but to negotiate. Richard II, a slight, fair boy of 14, accompanied by his knights, rode out to meet the insurgents and hear their demands: abolition of the poll tax and of all bonds of servile status, commutation at a rate of 4 pence an acre, free use of forests, abolition of the game laws, all these to be confirmed in charters sealed by the king. Everything the rebels asked was conceded in the hope of getting them to disperse and go home. Meanwhile, partisans had opened the city's gates and bridges to a group led by Wat Tyler, who gained possession of the Tower of London and murdered Archbishop Sudbury and Sir Robert Hales. Balked of Gaunt, they flung themselves upon his palace of the Savoy and tore it apart in an orgy of burning and smashing. At Wat Tyler's order, it was to be not looted but destroyed. Barrels of gunpowder found in storage were thrown on the flames, tapestries ripped, precious jewels pounded to bits with axe heads. The temple, center of the law with all its deeds and records, was similarly destroyed. Killing followed. Lombards and Flemings, hated simply as foreigners, magnates, officials, and designated traitors, such as the rich merchant Sir Richard Lyons, who had been impeached by the good Parliament and restored by Lancaster, were hunted down and slain. In the hectic sequence of events, only Richard moved in a magic circle of reverence for the king's person. Perched on a tall war horse before the peasants, a charming boy robed in purple, embroidered with the royal leopards, wearing a crown and carrying a gold rod, gracious and smiling and gaining confidence from his sway over the mob, he granted charters written out and distributed by 30 clerks on the spot. On this basis, many groups of peasants departed, believing in the king as their protector. While in London, Sir Robert Knollys, the Master of War, was urgently assembling an armed force. Wat Tyler, inflamed by blood and conquest, was exhorting his followers toward a massacre of the ruling class and a takeover of London. He was no longer to be satisfied by the promised charters, which he suspected were hollow, and he knew he would never be included in any pardon. He could only go forward toward a seizure of power. According to Walsingham, he boasted that, in 4 days' time, all the laws of England would be issuing from his mouth. He returned to the camp at Smithfield for another meeting with the king, where he put forth a new set of demands so extreme as to suggest that their purpose was to provoke rejection and provide a pretext for seizing Richard in person. All inequalities of rank and status were to be abolished, all men to be equal below the king, the church to be disendowed, and its estates divided among the commons, England to have but one bishop, and the rest of the hierarchy to be eliminated. The king promised everything consistent with the regality of his crown. Accounts of the next moments are so variously colored by the passions of the time that the scene remains forever obscure. Apparently, Tyler picked a quarrel with a squire of the king's retinue, drew a dagger, and in a flash was himself struck down by the short sword of William Walworth, Mayor of London. All was confusion and frenzy. The peasants drew their bows, some arrows flew. Richard, with extraordinary nerve, ordering no one to follow, rode forward alone, saying to the rebels, "Sirs, what is it you require? I am your captain, I am your king, quiet yourselves." While he parleyed, Knolles's force, hastily summoned, rode up and surrounded the camp in mailed might, with visors down and weapons gleaming. Dismayed and leaderless, the peasants were cowed. Wat Tyler's head displayed on a lance completed their collapse, like that of the Jacques at the death of Guillaume Caillet. Ordered to lay down their arms, and assured of pardons to encourage dispersal, they trailed homeward. Leaders, including John Ball, were hanged, and the rising elsewhere in England was suppressed, with sufficient brutality, if not the wild massacre that had taken place in France after the Jacquerie. Except for scattered retribution, the English revolt, too, was over within a month, defeated more by fraud than by force. The pardons issued in the king's name were revoked without compunction, and the charters cancelled by a landowner's parliament on the grounds that they had been issued under duress. To a deputation from Essex, who came to remind the king of his promise to end villanage, Richard replied, "Villains you are, and villains ye shall remain."
Now there's a lot to be said about this reading, no doubt. And we should begin by first of all pointing out that this is a bit of narrative, historical narrative, that will tell us something about what happens when peasants try to revolt. Now, of course, notice that there's a narrative that's told in chronological order that culminates with Tyler's attack on London, and as well, this 14-year-old Richard II, who, because he's the king, believes he cannot be touched by the peasants. Ultimately, the peasants will, of course, succumb to a bit of strategy. Ultimately, the leaders of the revolt will be killed themselves, and the peasants' revolt will ultimately end. And then all of the promises that were made for equality and the like, all will go away. Now, this is, of course, our reading. Let's talk a little bit at 2A about possible messages, themes. Well, one possible clear message or theme here is that when people are disgruntled and they grow upset, they will find themselves in groups together demanding that something change. Of course, those in power don't want to give up that power, and to that degree, we are going to see manipulation at the highest levels to hold on to that power. And that's exactly what happens here. Of course, the obvious question is, why didn't they just knock young Richard off of his horse and just take over London? And the answer is because they had a certain kind of respect or regard for the position of the king. That's, of course, what allowed ultimately for the noblemen to hold and retain power. Now, of course, at 2B, as we ask about rhetoric here, notice that we've got a very clear, linear kind of storytelling that's happening. And it allows us to be able to follow from the beginning of the story to the end of the story the downfall of the Peasants' Revolt. At 3A, what are the titles that come to mind here? Well, we're definitely going to put Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto here, because Marx had a lot to say about this kind of thing. He, of course, predicted that there would be a similar kind of uprising revolution by the workers of the world to unite. We've given lectures on this elsewhere at learnstrong.net. And, of course, we're familiar in the 20th century with what these revolutions started to look like. Notice that in this reading, we have gestures towards the notion that when the peasants finally revolt, there will be a new tyrant that will take over and make the new laws. And of course, we're familiar with that. We also should probably write down Orwell's Animal Farm, which plays a very similar kind of game to analyze exactly how these types of revolts sometimes will happen and end. finally, at 3B, what are your thoughts about inequalities within society and the ways in which society has, certain elements of society has power that it does not want to give up? What are the means whereby understandings towards greater equality can happen? Well, there you go, an introduction to a powerful moment in history. Thank you.